Hey guys, tonight we're not standing outside the pretty postcard version of a castle, the kind with turrets, flags waving in the breeze, and Disney-level charm. No, we're going inside the real deal. And spoiler, it smells like smoke, sweat, damp stone, and chamber pots. But before we dive into drafty halls and dungeons that never quite make it into children's books, do me a favor. Subscribe and like the video, but only if you actually like this kind of thing. Don't pity like me. That's how medieval peasants got roped into wars. Guilt. And drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Because honestly, it's wild to think of someone in Chicago hearing about castles at 2 a.m. while someone in London is yawning into their pillow at midnight. Time zones are weird. Almost as weird as castles. Congratulations, you're in the Middle Ages and you live in a castle. Don't cheer. This isn't Hogwarts. This is a cold, echoing stone fortress designed to survive sieges, not to keep you warm. You sleep under animal skins. You share your room with fleas. And if you're lucky enough to be a servant, you share it with 3 other servants who snore like angry oxen. Let's start with the food. You imagine roast boars and endless feasts, and yes, technically those happened. But not for you. For you, it's pottage. Every day. Forever. A gloopy stew of grains, beans, and maybe, if God is feeling generous, a turnip. If you want meat, you better hope the Lord hosts a feast and drops a bone on the floor. And even then, watch out. Meat was often spoiled. People masked the taste with spices. Imagine spending a fortune on cinnamon just to hide the fact that your beef smells like something the dog buried last month. Now, let's talk about bathrooms. You think castles had shiny toilets? Nope. They had garderobes, which sounds fancy, until you realize it's just a stone seat with a hole that drops straight into the moat. That's right. The moat wasn't just for defending against armies, it was also a medieval sewer. So when invaders charged your castle walls, they weren't just facing archers and boiling oil. They were charging through centuries of, let's call it, historical fertilizer. Romantic, right? And what about the dungeons? Oh, the dungeons. Every castle guidebook whispers about them. But here's the truth. A lot of dungeons weren't actually designed for torture. They were just damp basements that eventually doubled as holding cells. But of course, medieval creativity kicked in, and suddenly basements were doubling as torture galleries. Racks, chains, cages too small to stand in. If you were really unlucky, you'd get tossed in an oubliette, a pit you were literally forgotten in. The French word means to forget. That's not a metaphor. That's Tuesday. But here's a dark secret. The people who suffered most in castles weren't invaders or enemies. They were the people who lived there every day. The kitchen staff roasting themselves alive over open flames. The servants scrubbing floors with icy water until their hands split. The kids running errands up spiral staircases so narrow they gave you vertigo. And all of it under the watchful eyes of the lords and ladies, who weren't exactly paragons of hygiene. Remember, this was a world where bathing was considered suspicious. If you smelled too clean, people thought you were hiding something. Castles also had strange rules. For example, dogs were allowed in the Great Hall, but cats? Suspicious. Because cats, you see, were considered witchy. Never mind that they were the only things keeping rats out of the grain. Better to trust a terrier than the one creature that could actually prevent famine. Brilliant!
Oh, and speaking of rats, they were everywhere. In your bed, in your kitchen, in your ale. One monk actually complained in a letter that rats kept stealing his bread during prayers. Imagine trying to beg God for mercy while a rat tugs on your crust. But here's my favorite secret. Castles were noisy. We think of them as silent ruins today, but in their prime, they were loud. Clanging blacksmiths, screaming geese, servants gossiping, dogs barking. A lute that always sounds slightly out of tune, and underneath it all, the constant drip of water through the stones, reminding you that this place wasn't built for comfort. It was built to last. And yet, despite the filth, the noise, the stink, the rules, castles worked. They protected their lords, they terrified their enemies, and they gave us centuries of myths that turned into fairy tales. But the truth is darker. Behind every glittering banquet was a smoky kitchen where servants coughed their lungs out. Behind every shining knight was a dungeon full of screens. And behind every romantic turret was a draft so cold it could kill you before the enemy ever tried. So tonight, as you drift off, forget the fairy tales. Picture the real castle, the rattling chains in the basement, the moat that smells like a toilet, the servant stirring the same pot and stew for the third year in a row. That's the dark secret of castles. They weren't magical. They were miserable. And somehow, that's why they lasted. Good night.